Everyone knew the image before they knew the woman. Consuelo Vanderbilt entered the world wrapped in the kind of radiance that made newspapers, hostesses, and ambitious mothers speak of her less as a child than as an event. She was born into one of the richest families in America, raised beneath chandeliers, surrounded by polished silver, imported lace, and the hard glitter of Gilded Age triumph. To the public eye, hers was the perfect inheritance: beauty, pedigree, youth, and a future purchased in advance by money so vast it seemed to cancel ordinary human suffering. And then came the title. From a distance, her marriage looked like the ultimate transatlantic fairy tale. An American heiress crossing into the oldest ranks of British aristocracy, wealth marrying lineage, new world force buying its seat beside old world permanence. It was the sort of union society liked to present as destiny: elegant, strategic, inevitable. But behind that polished arrangement was something colder and far more brutal. Because Consuelo Vanderbilt was not led toward happiness, she was maneuvered toward sacrifice. What the public celebrated as a dazzling ascent was, for her, a submission staged in silk and diamonds. The palace, the name, the photographs, the ceremony, all of it concealed the more intimate truth: that a young woman's life had been seized, negotiated, and delivered into a system that prized inheritance over feeling, appearances over consent, and family ambition over personal freedom. The cruelest part is that the illusion did not collapse slowly. It shattered almost at once. Before the wedding flowers had faded, before the fantasy had time to harden into memory, Consuelo was confronted with the private truth of the bargain that had been made around her. And from that moment on, what looked to the outside world like glory began to reveal itself for what it really was: a dynastic transaction, a beautifully upholstered captivity, and one of the saddest marriages of the Gilded Age. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born into a world that confused wealth with virtue and spectacle with destiny. In 1877, her arrival carried the kind of meaning only the Gilded Age could manufacture: not simply the birth of a child, but the unveiling of an asset, an heirloom in human form, a daughter so perfectly placed that entire drawing rooms could imagine the future through her. She was the first child and only daughter of William K. Vanderbilt and Alva Vanderbilt, which meant that from the first breath she took, she belonged not merely to a family, but to a campaign. She was born into one of the richest dynasties in the United States at the exact moment that new money was trying to force its way into old society. And in that struggle, a girl like Consuelo was not raised to live. She was raised to signify. There is something almost chilling about the way these great American dynasties spoke of daughters without always saying so directly. A son might extend the line. A daughter could sanctify it. Through beauty, marriage, and perfect social choreography, she could do what railroads and millions could not: make the vulgar seem inevitable, make the newly rich appear ancient, make appetite look like legitimacy. Consuelo, by all accounts, was dazzling enough for the role. She had beauty that people described as if it were public property, the kind that drew admiration before she was old enough to understand its price. And because she was beautiful, because she was rich, because she was born at the center of a family determined to conquer American society and then surpass it, she became the object upon which too many ambitions were placed. No one placed more on her than her mother. Alva Vanderbilt is often remembered as formidable, brilliant, socially ruthless, one of those women history half admires because it cannot quite decide whether to condemn her. She had nerve, taste, and a ferocious instinct for hierarchy. She also had a conscience shaped by power rather than tenderness. Born in the South and marked by the moral deformities of a slaveholding world, Alva learned early that status was something to be enforced, displayed, and defended. She understood humiliation intimately and appears to have made a private religion out of never suffering it again. By the time she entered New York society, she was not merely determined to rise. She was determined to compel acceptance from the very families who considered the Vanderbilts rich but crude, indispensable but not equal. That ambition did not remain confined to ballrooms and architecture. It entered the nursery. For Alva, motherhood seems to have been less an arena of nurture than one of authorship. Consuelo was not simply her daughter, she was her most exquisite project. The child's face, carriage, habits, posture, voice, friendships, even her silences, all had to be shaped toward an ideal that was at once social and deeply personal. Perfection was demanded not because perfection exists, but because it gave power an excuse to punish. In houses like these, cruelty rarely announced itself as cruelty. It arrived as discipline, as refinement, as standards. It wore gloves, it lowered its voice, it called itself love. From an early age, Consuelo learned that privilege could be claustrophobic, even violent. Her mother's methods were not merely strict, they were invasive, humiliating, and obsessive. A child's body was treated as something to be corrected into elegance. Her bearing had to be trained, her movements monitored, her presentation curated down to the smallest detail. The young girl was forced into physical regimens meant to produce aristocratic grace, as though the body itself were a defective draft requiring iron intervention. The message was unmistakable. Even nature had not done enough. She would have to be finished by force. And then there was the emotional atmosphere, which may have been worse. Children raised in magnificent houses are often imagined to live at a great soft distance from ordinary suffering. But luxury can conceal its own species of terror. In Consuelo's world, affection seems to have been conditional, approval unstable, and obedience the only reliable path to temporary peace. To displease Alva was not merely to invite correction. It was to risk the full theatrical intensity of a mother who saw contradiction as betrayal. A misplaced word, a note of resistance, a flicker of personal preference, small things in healthy homes, could become occasions for disproportionate fury. The punishments were designed not only to hurt, but to establish authorship. The child was to understand that her will, if it existed at all, existed on sufferance. One of the darkest truths in stories like this is that domination often begins in grammar. Before there is a contract, before there is a marriage, before there is a headline, there is a household in which one person is permitted to think and another is expected to comply. Consuelo was taught that her own taste had little moral standing. Her body could be dressed against its wishes. Her preferences could be dismissed as childish, foolish, irrelevant. What mattered was not what she felt, but what she represented. The private lesson was devastating and simple. You are not here to choose. You are here to be chosen. That is how a dynasty prepares a daughter for sacrifice, long before the sacrifice is named. It is tempting to treat this phase of Consuelo's life as mere prologue, as the difficult childhood that explains the more public tragedy to come. But that would be too gentle to the system that formed her. This was not background noise. This was the architecture of the later disaster. The great houses, the gowns, the guests, the polished rituals of upper-class life, none of them were neutral settings. They were training grounds. They taught a girl to endure scrutiny, suppress instinct, mistrust her own desires, and confuse submission with duty. By the time the world would one day see Consuelo Vanderbilt adorned for society, poised and luminous beneath the weight of family expectation, much of the hardest work had already been done. The rebellion had been weakened at the root. And that is what makes her story so bleakly American. Because the child the world envied was, in private, being prepared not for happiness, but for use. She was born into almost unimaginable privilege, yet denied one of the simplest human dignities, the right to become herself. Her beauty was admired, her name was celebrated, her future was discussed as though it were a national asset. But inside the family, where the real terms of power were set, Consuelo was learning a lesson that would haunt the rest of her life: that splendor can be a kind of prison, and that in dynasties built on conquest, even love can be made to serve ambition. By the time society began calling her fortunate, the real damage had already begun. By the time Consuelo Vanderbilt entered young womanhood, society had already begun to look at her the way empires look at territory, with appetite, calculation, and a strange confidence that her future could be spoken for before she had fully lived a day of it. She was still very young when the attention began to harden into pursuit. Men admired her, certainly, but admiration in that world was rarely innocent for long. Beauty of her kind did not move quietly through Gilded Age drawing rooms. It arrived preceded by rumor, by wealth, by the knowledge of what might be gained through proximity to it. Consuelo was not simply considered lovely. She was considered consequential. She was the daughter of one of the richest houses in America, raised under the full glare of social ambition, and her beauty made that fortune feel even more potent, more ceremonial, more dangerously complete. Offers, overtures, whispered intentions. They came early, and they came often, because everyone understood what marriage to a girl like Consuelo might mean. But the most decisive gaze upon her was not male, it was maternal. Alva Vanderbilt did not view her daughter's desirability as a tender milestone, or even as a private complication to be managed with care. She saw it as leverage. In her mind, Consuelo's beauty was not a fragile human fact. It was a social instrument, perhaps the most valuable one she possessed. And like all instruments of power, it was to be used precisely. An ordinary rich American husband would not do. A merely suitable match would not do. Even affection, compatibility, shared temperament, those soft domestic virtues, had no real standing against the scale of Alva's ambition. Her daughter, as she imagined it, was meant to do something grander than marry well. She was meant to elevate the family into a realm money alone could not purchase. Only the right title, the right bloodline, the right ancient name could complete the transformation Alva desired. This is one of the grimmer patterns in dynastic history. Daughters are praised as treasures while being treated as strategy. The language around them is flattering, but the logic is transactional. They are adored in public, appraised in private, and quietly ushered toward futures designed by other people. Consuelo's case was especially cruel because she possessed that dangerous combination of gifts that made others feel entitled to decide for her: great beauty, great wealth, and a temperament gentle enough to be mistaken for pliancy. Around such a girl, society becomes very efficient at renaming control as destiny. And then, against this machinery, something inconvenient happened. She fell in love. Winthrop Rutherford did not represent escape in the fairy tale sense. He was not some reckless outsider riding in from another world. He came from the same social altitude, moved in the same circles, and belonged to the same polished New York universe in which names mattered and lineage was its own currency. He was not beneath her in rank or background. If anything, he offered the rare possibility of a match that could have satisfied both affection and status. But to Alva, that was beside the point. He lacked the one feature that mattered most: spectacle. He carried no European title, no ancestral coronet, no decayed old-world grandeur that could be purchased with new American money. He may have been acceptable to a sane family. He was useless to an imperial one. That is what made the romance so precarious from the beginning. Consuelo could not love openly, because openness belonged to people who governed their own lives. She had already been trained to understand that desire, once detected, could be disciplined. So the relationship existed in that tense, airless space common to young women raised under surveillance, part hope, part secrecy, part dread. To care for someone was one thing, to let one's mother know was another. In houses built on control, discovery is often more frightening than heartbreak. What survives in scenes like this And what makes them so moving is the smallness of the rebellion. History tends to privilege wars, lawsuits, abdications, formal scandals. But for a daughter shaped by years of obedience, a secret promise can be revolutionary. A private understanding, a stolen conversation, a few minutes outside the radius of supervision. These are not minor acts in such a life. They are the first signs that a self still exists beneath the choreography. Not long after turning 18, Consuelo reached for that self. The setting could hardly have been more deceptively innocent. A bicycle outing in Manhattan, the sort of fashionable leisure that made the late 19th century seem, at least on the surface, so bright and civilized. There were companions, movement, the acceptable noise of a public afternoon. Her mother was present. Society, in other words, was present. And yet within that carefully managed scene, a smaller drama opened. For a moment, separated from the others, Consuelo and Winthrop stepped into the brief privacy that well-bred young lovers of that era were forced to construct out of almost nothing. It was there that he asked her to marry him. One can imagine the compressed urgency of it. No grand theatrical declarations, no long sentimental ease, but something swifter, tighter, made fragile by circumstance. When people have time, they can afford elegance. When power is closing in, they speak quickly. What mattered was not the perfection of the proposal, but the fact of it. The sudden appearance of a future not authored by Alva Vanderbilt. And Consuelo, with all the fear and hope such a moment must have contained, said yes. That yes matters. It matters because it was not only a romantic acceptance, it was a moral act, however young and vulnerable she still was. It was one of the clearest instances in which she attempted to choose herself. Not perfectly, not triumphantly, not with the full force of independence that later generations like to imagine, but genuinely. For perhaps the first time, she placed her own emotional life above the architecture being built around her. In a family where so much had already been decided in advance, that small decision glowed with a kind of defiance. But the timing was merciless. Almost immediately, the lovers found themselves racing against a larger design. The very next day, Consuelo was scheduled to leave for Europe with her mother, under the polished pretext of travel, cultivation, and continental refinement. The stated purpose, as with so many elite rituals, sounded tasteful enough. A young American heiress would be broadened by exposure to foreign courts, old cities, grand houses, and the highest society abroad. Yet underneath the velvet language lay a far more practical mission. She was being taken into the marketplace. Europe, for women like Consuelo, was not merely a destination. It was a showroom of titles. That was the brutal arithmetic of the age. American fortunes sought aristocratic legitimacy. Impoverished noble families sought rescue through American cash. Mothers like Alva understood this perfectly. Behind the invitations, the dinners, the calling cards, and the stately hospitality was a transatlantic economy of need and vanity. Young women were expected to move through it beautifully, as though their own hearts were irrelevant to the deal. Consuelo was not being escorted toward culture. She was being positioned. And yet even then, love still tried to imagine itself stronger than design. Winthrop promised he would follow. He would come after her, remain faithful, and hold them both to the possibility they had just created. There is something deeply poignant in that promise, not because it was naive, though it may have been, but because it reveals how young people in unequal struggles often survive at first, through belief. Through the conviction that feeling can outrun structure, that sincerity can defeat calculation, that if two people remain brave enough, the machinery around them might somehow fail. But dynastic machinery rarely fails by accident. It studies weakness, it exploits delay, it counts on distance. And already, even in the afterglow of that hidden engagement, The forces gathering around Consuelo were larger than either lover may have been willing to admit. She had made a choice, but she had made it inside a system that did not recognize her right to choose. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting feature of this chapter in her life. Before the palace, before the wedding, before the full brutality of what awaited her, there was this brief, flickering interval in which another future almost came into view. A future built not on title, barter, and maternal conquest, but on mutual desire and a private promise made in motion, just beyond the reach of the crowd. It would not last, but it was real. And because it was real, everything that followed would hurt more. Europe was supposed to look like enchantment. That, at least, was the official version. For months, Consuelo moved through a glittering circuit of receptions, country houses, private dinners, formal calls, and carefully curated afternoons, one aristocratic tableau after another, each one designed to flatter, impress, and soften resistance. There were polished drawing rooms, lit by old money and older titles, tea services laid out with effortless precision, women trained to make rank look natural, and men whose names carried the faded authority of centuries. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a season of privilege at its most seductive. A young American heiress, beautiful and rich, welcomed into the highest social world Europe could offer. But the trip was never innocent. What passed publicly as cultivation was, in truth, a campaign. Consuelo was not being shown the world so much as displayed within it. Every invitation, every introduction, every carefully managed encounter formed part of a larger design. She was being led through a market disguised as society, a place where pedigree could still be traded, and where American money, however vulgar old Europe pretended to find it, had become impossible to ignore. The rooms were elegant, the purpose was brutal. And beneath all that surface brilliance, another drama was unfolding, the quieter, more devastating one. Consuelo had left America carrying the secret hope of Winthrop Rutherford's promise. There had been that moment of private rebellion, that fragile agreement between two young people who believed, perhaps because youth often must, that feeling could survive machinery. He would follow. He would find her. Somehow, beyond the choreography of chaperones and titles and maternal supervision, they would hold on to the future they had dared to imagine together. At first, she waited in the feverish way only the young and the trapped can wait. Every day contained the possibility of a letter. Every stop on the journey carried the chance of news. Each new city, each hotel, each drawing room might suddenly become the place where the silence ended. But silence, when it stretches long enough, begins to alter its meaning. What starts as suspense curdles into dread, then humiliation, then something even crueler, self-doubt. Weeks passed, then months. He did not appear. No message seemed to reach her. No reassuring word arrived to hold together the promise they had made. Nothing came that could explain the absence, soften it, or even name it. For a young woman already raised to distrust the validity of her own hopes, that silence must have felt like a private collapse. It is hard enough to be disappointed. It is worse to be left in uncertainty, forced to choose between believing yourself abandoned and blaming yourself for expecting too much. This is one of the uglier luxuries of power. It can make another person appear faithless simply by obstructing access. It can manufacture emotional reality. It can turn interference into heartbreak, and then let the victim absorb the injury as though it were a personal failure. Only later did Consuelo understand what had actually happened. Winthrop had not forgotten her. He had not casually surrendered. He had, in fact, followed her to Europe, crossing the Atlantic in pursuit of the life they had planned in whispers and fragments. He had come to Paris. He had tried to reach her. He had done what he said he would do. But he was not contending merely with geography or social inconvenience. He was contending with Alva Vanderbilt. By then, Alva had already recognized the danger. She understood that romance, left unbroken, could become disobedience. And disobedience, in a daughter destined for use, could not be tolerated. So she did what controlling people so often do best. She moved invisibly. She blocked access, denied proximity, controlled the flow of information, and transformed her daughter's world into a sealed chamber. If Winthrop tried to call, he was kept away. If he wrote, the letters never reached Consuelo. They were stopped, absorbed, destroyed before they could do what letters are meant to do, carry truth across distance. There is something especially chilling about the destruction of correspondence. It feels small beside the grander violences of history, but it is often more intimate, more surgical. A letter is a human voice flattened into paper. To intercept it is not only to prevent communication, it is to replace reality with a curated lie. It is to stand between two people and quietly assume the right to decide what each is permitted to know of the other. In that sense, Alva was not merely managing her daughter's life. She was editing it. And while Consuelo's hope was being slowly starved out in elegant rooms, her mother had already chosen the man who would replace it. He was everything the age considered impressive. Charles Richard, John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, belonged to one of the most storied noble houses in Britain, a family wrapped in military triumph, dynastic prestige, political memory, and the architectural grandeur of Blenheim Palace itself. The name carried weight before the man even entered the room. To someone like Alva, this was not simply a prospective husband. It was vindication in human form. A title of that magnitude could do what even Vanderbilt money had not fully accomplished: force old hierarchies to yield. It is important to understand the psychological elegance of such ambition. Alva did not merely want her daughter to marry well. She wanted conquest dressed as acceptance. She wanted the old world to open its gates, not out of affection, not out of equality, but because American wealth had made refusal impossible. Consuelo, in this design, was less daughter than emissary. Her marriage would function as the final argument in a long social war. And what of Marlborough himself? That is one of the saddest features of the story. Consuelo does not appear to have hated him at first. Hatred at least implies a charged emotional reality. What she felt seems closer to detachment. He did not set her heart on fire, nor did he inspire in her some immediate dread. He was presentable, sufficiently agreeable, possessed of the kind of outward correctness that often passes for character in highly formal societies. He made no deep claim upon her imagination. He was simply there, carrying the immense symbolic value that so dazzled her mother, which, of course, made him ideal for the arrangement. Great coercive systems prefer bland surfaces. They thrive on people who look respectable from a distance. Because behind the polish, the Duke had a problem of his own. Like a number of British aristocrats of the period, he had inherited magnificence without the means to sustain it. The title was ancient. The obligations were enormous. The house itself, vast, historic, ruinously expensive, was both inheritance and burden. Beneath the grandeur lay financial fragility, the sort that old aristocratic families learned to conceal behind ritual, staff, acreage, and the lingering theatre of rank. When he succeeded to his dukedom, he also inherited the truth that lineage alone could not pay the bills. The name was illustrious. The balance sheet was another matter. So the moral geometry of the match comes into focus with terrible clarity. Consuelo was being delivered to a man whose family had history but needed money. Marlborough represented the old nobility at precisely the moment it had become vulnerable enough to bargain. And Alva, far from recoiling at the transactional nature of this, embraced it. Why wouldn't she? The very thing that might have repulsed a more humane mother, that her daughter was being valued as a financial solution, made the arrangement more attractive to her, not less. Need sharpened opportunity. His weakness completed her design. This was the ancient bargain in modern dress: cash for coronet, millions for legitimacy, a young woman's life exchanged across the Atlantic to stabilize two different forms of social insecurity. He needed rescue, Alva needed triumph, and Consuelo, as ever, was expected to become the bridge between those appetites without complaint. That is why this chapter of her life feels so haunted. On one side stands a young woman waiting in vain for proof that the man she loved still existed somewhere beyond the silence. On the other stands the machinery already assembling the substitute future: a nobler name, a grander house, a colder destiny. The tragedy is not merely that love was thwarted, it is that it was suffocated under layers of etiquette, strategy, and maternal will so polished that society could mistake the entire process for elegance. By the time Consuelo understood what had been taken from her, the next act had already begun. By this point, Alva Vanderbilt no longer behaved like a mother guarding a daughter's future. She behaved like a sovereign suppressing a revolt. She understood the danger with perfect clarity. If Consuelo were given even the smallest opening, an unguarded afternoon, a sympathetic servant, a letter that slipped through, a carriage ride not properly watched, she might return to Winthrop Rutherford and choose love over strategy. And that, to Alva, was intolerable. Too much had been planned. Too much had been projected onto her daughter's face, her fortune, her marriageability. Consuelo was not supposed to have a private destiny. She was supposed to fulfill a public one. So the machinery of control tightened. Consuelo was kept under a kind of domestic arrest, confined not by iron bars, but by maternal authority, social dependence, and the suffocating etiquette of her class. It is one of the peculiar cruelties of elite history that imprisonment so often arrives upholstered, inside a beautiful room, inside a famous house, under the language of protection. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss. Inside, a young woman was being sealed off from the one person who represented another life. She could not reach Winthrop. She could not warn him. She could not explain the silence into which she had apparently disappeared. Her isolation was not accidental. It was engineered. And yet even the most controlled worlds contain cracks. Alva could not keep her daughter entirely out of sight. Society demanded appearances. A Vanderbilt daughter had to be seen, displayed, circulated through the ballrooms that converted private coercion into public elegance. So Consuelo, though tightly monitored, was still brought into those glittering interiors where chandeliers, music, and jewels made everything look harmless. This is how power often preserves itself, by staging beauty around brutality until the brutality becomes difficult to name. At one of those evenings, the impossible happened. Consuelo saw Winthrop. After months of separation, confusion, and imposed silence, they found each other not in safety, not in privacy, but in the middle of the very world that had conspired to pull them apart. One can imagine the shock of it, the sudden collapse of all that uncertainty into a living face. And then the dance. Brief, exposed, fragile, charged with everything they had not been allowed to say. In another kind of life, it might have been romantic. In hers, it was almost unbearable. He told her he still loved her. He told her he wanted them to run. That detail matters because it restored, if only for a moment, the moral truth Alva had tried to erase. Consuelo had not been abandoned. The silence had been manufactured. The love she had been pressured to doubt was still there, waiting for her beneath the elaborate falsehoods of family discipline and social ambition. In a fairer world, that would have been the turning point. The lovers would have slipped free of the room, or at least left it with a plan that belonged to them. But fair worlds are rare in dynastic stories. Alva was watching. She saw enough. She always did. The pair were separated almost immediately, the moment cut short with the efficiency of someone practiced in extinguishing unwelcome feeling. By the time they returned home, the atmosphere had already changed. The evening's glamour had curdled into something colder. Alva summoned her daughter for the private reckoning that inevitably followed any sign of independence. And this time, something in Consuelo finally rose to meet it. She was not, by nature, theatrical or defiant. Years of conditioning had made her cautious, dutiful, and frightened of conflict, which is precisely why this moment feels so important. She did not merely tremble, apologize, or retreat into silence. She said, plainly, that she intended to marry Winthrop Rutherford. It was one of the clearest acts of self-assertion in her young life, a direct claim laid against the structure that had been built around her since childhood. She chose, however briefly, to speak as though her own heart had authority. Alva answered as power often does when it is challenged at close range, with fury. She attacked the idea, the man, the daughter daring to voice it. Love, in Alva's hands, became foolishness. Personal will became ingratitude. A young woman's wish to marry the person she actually loved was treated not as a human preference, but as a kind of stupidity. Small, embarrassing, beneath the larger logic of family advancement. This is the brutal genius of coercive households. They make the victim feel childish for desiring an ordinary life. Then came the performance that broke her. The next morning, Consuelo was told that her resistance had brought on catastrophe, that her mother had suffered a grave medical collapse and now lay near death. Whether it was manipulation in the strictest sense or a melodrama weaponized in real time almost hardly matters. The result was the same. The burden was placed directly where Alva knew it would do the most damage, on her daughter's conscience. Consuelo, already trained to feel responsible for emotional storms she did not create, could not bear the thought that her insistence on happiness might literally kill her mother. And so she surrendered. Instead of fighting, she sent word that the engagement was over. She withdrew from the man she loved not because her feelings had changed, not because she no longer wished to be with him, but because guilt had been made stronger than freedom. It is one of the most devastating forms of control, to compel obedience not through force alone, but through the fear of becoming a murderer in the eyes of your own conscience. Then, with terrible convenience, Alva recovered. That recovery hangs over the story like a stain. It suggests not simply calculation, but a level of emotional ruthlessness, almost too ugly for polite society to admit. And yet, polite society admitted much worse, provided it wore the right clothes and moved through the right rooms. By then, the damage was done. The rebellion had been crushed. The daughter had yielded. And the future Alva wanted, cold, glittering, fatal, could proceed. By the late summer of 1895, the contest was over. Alva Vanderbilt had spent years diminishing her daughter's ability to refuse, correcting, directing, isolating, deciding, until resistance itself began to seem almost unreal. What remained now was not persuasion, but execution. The emotional siege had done its work. Consuelo's private hopes had been cornered, her first great love pushed out of reach, her conscience turned against her, her obedience rebranded as duty. At that point, Alva no longer needed to win her daughter over. She needed only to stage the conclusion. And she staged it brilliantly. The Duke of Marlborough was brought forward not simply as a suitor, but as the answer to a long social campaign. He was installed within the Vanderbilt orbit with all the deliberate ceremony of a man being eased toward acquisition. Invitations multiplied. Appearances were arranged. Newspapers were fed. The machinery of upper-class publicity, so polished, so discreet, so capable of making force look festive, began to hum around the match. Consuelo was set in motion beside him, carried from gathering to gathering, placed under chandeliers, escorted through rooms full of people meant to witness what was now being treated as destiny. The cruelty of such arrangements is that they make the victim collaborate in her own disappearance. She must dress for it, stand through it, smile through it, let herself be looked at while others decide what her expression means. Around Consuelo, the social world responded exactly as Alva intended. A Vanderbilt daughter on the arm of an English duke was not merely a personal development, it was an event. The old transatlantic fantasy, American money joined to European rank, was too irresistible to leave uncelebrated. And so the courtship advanced under a haze of flowers, gossip, and expensive light, while the inner truth of it remained what it had always been, a young woman being maneuvered toward a marriage she had not freely chosen. This is where the public imagination so often fails women like Consuelo. People assume that grandeur must contain pleasure, or at least consolation, but splendor is morally empty. It can decorate a coercion as easily as a love story. A carriage does not sanctify consent. A ballroom does not soften dread. If anything, luxury can make violence harder to name, because it teaches everyone present to mistake beauty for legitimacy. The proposal itself seems to have carried that same strange emptiness. The Duke offered the proper form of things, but not their warmth. He was presentable, well-born, outwardly composed, the kind of man elite society found easy to approve of, because he did not disturb the surface. Yet there was little in the scene to suggest ardor, nothing of mutual urgency, nothing of that intimate inevitability that makes a proposal feel like the natural culmination of shared feeling. What emerged instead was the colder logic of arrangement. He fit the role. He completed the design. He was, in every useful sense, sufficient. Once the engagement became public, the newspapers did what newspapers of that era so often did to rich young women. They flattened a life into a type. Consuelo was folded into the already familiar spectacle of the American heiress crossing the Atlantic to rescue an old title with new money. Society might dress such unions in romance, but the press understood the transaction well enough to mock it. The phrase attached to women like her was glamorous on the surface and degrading underneath. A glittering label that reduced a daughter, an inheritance, and a human life to a financial category. She was no longer simply Consuelo. She had become a social emblem, a symbol in satin of the age's favorite bargain. Cash for coronet, millions for ancestry, youth for prestige. And even within that humiliation, the Duke managed to reveal something worse. There are moments in stories like this when a person's priorities become visible, not through confession, but through etiquette. As the wedding approached, the rituals surrounding it exposed the emotional imbalance with painful clarity. There was a rehearsal, of course, an elaborate exercise in placement, timing, choreography, the precise management of who should stand where on the appointed day. This part mattered deeply to the women required to carry the emotional burden of spectacle. It mattered less to the man whose presence had already been secured. He saw no need to attend. The custom, apparently, offended his sensibilities. Yet when the conversation turned from ceremonial detail to financial settlement, he arrived. On that point, there was no reluctance. The dowry required his full attention, and he gave it. No single gesture can explain a marriage, but some gestures expose its moral weather. To absent oneself from the rehearsal while appearing for the money is not merely rude. It is revelatory. It tells us what is ornamental and what is essential. It tells us who is expected to care about beauty and who is there for value. By then, anyone willing to look clearly could have seen the shape of the bargain. The pageantry was for society. The money was for Blenheim. Then came the wedding itself, November 6, 1895, the day toward which all of Alva's ambition had been driving. By any public standard, it was magnificent. The clothes, the flowers, the guest list, the layers of influence and display, everything was designed to project triumph. But some ceremonies are so perfect, they become accusatory. They reveal, precisely because every visible detail has been controlled, how little room remains for the human being at the center. Consuelo was dressed in garments chosen not as expressions of her will, but as components of a vision assembled long before her happiness had ceased to matter. The women around her had been selected, the order had been set. Even the emotional tone of the day had, in theory, been planned for her. Yet the body sometimes refuses the script. For all the money, all the rank, all the careful arrangement, the truth had not been fully subdued. It showed where truth so often shows, on the face. In the church, before some of the most powerful people of the age, amid every luxury wealth could marshal, the bride appeared not radiant but stricken. However polished the spectacle, it could not entirely conceal the evidence that she had been crying. And that detail lingers because it punctures the mythology of the scene. The great heiress, the English duke, the perfect alliance, the triumph of family ambition, beneath all of it stood a young woman visibly grieving at her own wedding. That is the image worth keeping. Not the jewels, not the headlines, not the fantasy of an American princess ascending into European glory, but the quieter, harsher truth hidden inside the ceremony. A daughter dressed for sacrifice, a fortune handed over under the name of marriage, and a room full of powerful people willing to call it splendid. The marriage had scarcely begun before its mask came off. There are unions that decay slowly, with disappointments arriving in increments, each one small enough to be denied until the whole structure finally collapses. And then there are marriages like Consuelo Vanderbilt's, those in which the truth appears almost immediately, so coldly and so completely that whatever innocence remains is extinguished before the wedding flowers have even had time to fade. This was one of those. From the outside, the honeymoon still belonged to the world of ceremony. The bride was an American heiress of astonishing beauty and fortune. The groom was one of the grandest noblemen in England, heir to a palace, a name, and centuries of inherited prestige. Society had already composed the image it preferred: youth, rank, glamour, transatlantic triumph. The story was supposed to be one of arrival. A Vanderbilt daughter, dazzling and newly titled, moving at last into the old aristocratic world her mother had spent years trying to force open. But private life has a way of humiliating public fantasy. Very early, almost indecently early, the Duke made plain what the marriage actually was. Not in the language of apology, not with the awkward tenderness of a man confessing a painful truth he wishes were otherwise, but with the sort of cool detachment that can wound more deeply than rage. He did not offer the lie of romance long enough to spare her. He did not even pretend that affection might grow. Instead, he gave her the stripped, financial version of reality. He had married her to save Blenheim. That was the center of it. Behind the heraldry, the good breeding, the elaborate wedding, the old stone magnificence of his family's history, there stood a simple and ugly dependence. The house required rescue, the title required money, and Consuelo had been selected as the means of transfer. In one sense, none of this would have been wholly surprising to observers familiar with the era. Such matches were already part of the transatlantic order, American fortunes shoring up British estates, daughters turned into bridges between cash and ancestry. But there is a difference between understanding a system in the abstract and hearing as a bride that you yourself are one of its transactions, and he did not stop there. If admitting he had married for money was one cruelty, what followed was worse because it was so intimate in its precision. He told her, in effect, that she had not only been purchased into utility, but excluded from desire. His heart, such as he described it, belonged elsewhere. The emotional life she might reasonably have hoped to build with him had already been assigned to another woman. Whatever place remained for Consuelo within the marriage was narrower, more functional, almost feudal in its bluntness. She was there to secure the line, to provide legitimacy, money, and children. Not companionship, not passion, not even the consolation of being deceived gently. It is difficult to overstate the violence of such honesty when it is used as a weapon rather than a virtue. There are truths that liberate and truths that dominate. This was the second kind. The Duke's candor did not dignify Consuelo, it disciplined her. It told her, from the beginning, exactly how little she was permitted to expect. It narrowed the emotional terms of the marriage before she had even had the chance to discover them for herself. In a single stroke, he transformed the honeymoon from what society insists on calling a beginning into something more like an induction ceremony, her formal initiation into a life of ornamental usefulness. And one suspects that the manner of it mattered almost as much as the content. The cruelty was not melodramatic, it was administrative. That, perhaps, is what makes it so haunting. He seems to have spoken not like a guilty lover, but like a steward clarifying terms. The great ancestral house had to be maintained. The lineage had to continue. The private inconvenience of the bride's feelings was, from his point of view, secondary to these older obligations. In that worldview, candor becomes efficient. Why sentimentalize an arrangement when both parties have already been absorbed into it? Except, of course, they had not been absorbed equally. He retained the privileges of rank, male latitude, and emotional distance. Consuelo bore the human cost. She was the one uprooted, displayed, bartered, and then informed, once escape was no longer plausible, that the innermost premise of marriage would not apply to her. It is one of the oldest asymmetries in dynastic life. The institution protects itself by distributing pain unevenly. One party receives rescue, the other receives revelation. By the end of that journey, whatever remained of Consuelo's romantic imagination had been cut down at the root. The palace awaiting her was still magnificent. Blenheim had not shrunk. Its scale, history, and symbolic force were exactly what they had always been. But now she approached it stripped of illusion. She was not entering it as a beloved wife ascending into greatness. She was being delivered into a structure that had already defined her value and her limits. The house had been saved. The bargain had been honored. What remained was for her to live inside the consequences. That is why the arrival at Blenheim feels less like a homecoming than a sentence. Publicly, she had achieved the pinnacle so many American mothers fantasized about for their daughters. Title, palace, rank, a place in one of the greatest aristocratic houses in Europe. But inwardly, something essential had already been broken before she crossed the threshold. She had been told too soon, too clearly, and by the one person from whom tenderness might at least have been hoped, that she existed in the marriage as function before feeling. To arrive at such a house under those conditions was not triumph, it was enclosure. Before long, Gladys was no longer merely a guest. She became a presence, then a preference, then something close to a replacement. The Duke's attachment to her deepened into a long, consuming entanglement, one that would shape the emotional landscape of the marriage for years. It is tempting to describe such a woman as an intruder, but that would be too simple and too flattering to the institution that enabled her. Gladys did not invent the vacancy at the center of the Marlborough marriage. She entered it. And Consuelo, by then, was no innocent, waiting meekly in the shadows for conjugal justice. That is part of what makes this chapter so morally complex and so humanly painful. By the time her husband's affair became undeniable, she herself had already begun to move beyond the boundaries of marital fidelity. Not because she was frivolous, not because she had been liberated into some cheerful modern arrangement, but because a loveless marriage does not remain empty. Sooner or later, the emptiness begins to demand an answer. One of the first and most consequential of those answers was Winthrop Rutherford. The old love did not die simply because it had been obstructed. That is often the tragedy with first attachments broken by force. They remain alive, not in the easy way of youthful nostalgia, but as unfinished business, as a wound that never properly scars. Consuelo and Winthrop found their way back to one another after her marriage, and in that reunion, there must have been both sweetness and ruin. He represented not merely romance, but the life that had been taken from her before she was allowed to test it. To be with him now was not only an affair. It was an attempt, however compromised, to reclaim authorship over a story that had been written over her. Then came the birth of her second son, Ivor. By then, she had already supplied the marriage with its essential function: a son to continue the line, then another to secure it further. In the cold arithmetic of dynastic life, she had done everything required of her body. But even motherhood did not quiet the murmurs around her. Society, which forgives men almost everything and women almost nothing, quickly found nourishment in speculation. The younger boy's paternity became a subject of whisper and inference, the kind of rumor aristocratic families both deny publicly and feed privately. Whether such talk was malicious, perceptive, or simply irresistible gossip matters less than what it reveals. Once a woman's marriage is known to be emotionally vacant, her children themselves can become battlegrounds for the era's anxieties about legitimacy, desire, and control. For a brief interval, it appeared that Consuelo might still escape. Winthrop offered her something like a second chance. Again, there was the possibility of flight, of renunciation, of leaving behind the palace and title for a life chosen rather than assigned. And this time, strikingly, she did not proceed through secrecy alone. She went to her husband and told the truth. There is courage in that. Reckless, perhaps, but real. She laid the matter before him in the hope that honesty might finally open the door that coercion had long ago slammed shut. The Duke, characteristically remote, seems to have met the revelation not with wounded passion but with indifference, as though the emotional collapse of the marriage merely confirmed what he had known from the beginning. So she went to Winthrop, at last standing on the edge of the life she had wanted for years. And he failed her. There is a particular cruelty in being betrayed by the person you have used to survive your captivity. Winthrop, who had once symbolized rescue, faltered at the moment rescue required an adult cost. He hesitated, retreated, rationalized. Whatever language one chooses, the result was the same. When confronted with the reality of taking Consuelo out of the life that had imprisoned her, he could not bear the consequences. The future that had shimmered before her for so long collapsed, not through maternal force or aristocratic pressure this time, but through the weakness of the man himself. So she went back. Not restored, not reconciled, but altered. After that, the emotional logic of her affairs seems to have changed. They were no longer simply attempts at romantic recovery. Increasingly, they became instruments of injury, acts of retaliation, even gestures of contempt hurled at the structure that had swallowed her life. Some of those attachments formed within the Duke's own extended family, which gave them an additional sharpness. To take lovers from among his kin was not merely indiscreet. It was almost allegorical, a violation of the very bloodline into which she had been drafted. The respectable family, unsurprisingly, was appalled. But respectability is rarely a serious moral witness in stories like this. It is too invested in appearances. What it called scandal was, in part, the visible symptom of a deeper wrong. None of this made Consuelo blameless, and it would diminish her to pretend otherwise. Yet neither should her conduct be read with the shallow severity usually reserved for women trapped inside arrangements men were allowed to design. These affairs were not the behavior of a contented libertine. They read more like fragments of rebellion, damaged, compromising, self-wounding, but unmistakably born from confinement. By then, Blenheim had become what such marriages often become, not a sanctuary, not even a stable hypocrisy, but a beautifully furnished battlefield. The title remained, the palace endured, society still watched. But beneath the grandeur, everyone was improvising around a central truth no ceremony could repair: that the marriage had been dead almost from the start, and the living were now finding whatever ways they could to survive inside its ruins. When Consuelo Vanderbilt entered the Spencer-Churchill dynasty, she did more than marry into one of England's grandest houses. Without intending to, she altered the future of that house, and perhaps, in a small but consequential way, the future of Britain itself. Before Consuelo produced an heir, the succession to Blenheim carried a different shadow. Among those standing near that line was Winston Churchill, then merely a gifted, difficult, highly ambitious young relative with uncertain prospects and no guarantee that politics would become his destiny. But dynasties are reshaped by nurseries as often as by parliaments. With the birth of Consuelo's first son, the future of Blenheim was secured through her body, and Winston was released from the gravitational pull of inheritance. He could belong to history in another way. It is one of the strange ironies threaded through her life. A woman denied control over her own fate, nevertheless helped redirect the fate of men. By 1906, however, whatever symbolic value her marriage had once held was exhausted. The fairy tale had rotted in public view. After years of emotional desolation, humiliation, infidelity, and mutual bitterness, Consuelo and the Duke separated, shocking the world that had once celebrated their union as a triumph of money and rank. Separation alone was scandal enough in aristocratic circles, where appearances were often treated as moral achievements. But separation still allowed society its fiction. Divorce threatened to expose the machinery underneath, and exposure was exactly what made the proceedings so painful. The legal struggle stretched on with the slow brutality characteristic of elite collapse. Lawyers, petitions, negotiations, appearances, the public handling of private wreckage. By then, there was little doubt that the marriage had failed in substance long before it failed in law. Still, dynastic institutions do not loosen their grip easily. They prefer dead marriages to living truths. They would rather preserve the form than admit the coercion beneath it. Then came one of the most astonishing reversals in the story. Alva Vanderbilt, the very architect of her daughter's catastrophe, entered the courtroom and told the truth. By that stage in life, Alva had reinvented herself in ways that were as politically striking as they were morally complicated. She had attached herself to the cause of women's rights, speaking now in the language of female independence after having spent years crushing it in her own child. The contradiction was glaring, yet history is full of people who become fluent in justice only after committing private injustice of their own. Perhaps age had sharpened her conscience. Perhaps public principle had finally caught up with private guilt. Perhaps she simply could no longer bear the spectacle of what she had made. Whatever the motive, the confession mattered. On the stand, Alva admitted that Consuelo had been forced into the marriage. Beneath the jewels, the titles, the guest lists, and the architectural grandeur, she acknowledged the central obscenity of the whole affair. This had not been a union freely made. It had been an arrangement secured through pressure, fear, and maternal domination. In that moment, the polished legend collapsed, and what remained was the harder truth: a daughter sacrificed to ambition, and a mother, at last, unable to keep pretending otherwise. By 1921, after years of legal struggle, public scrutiny, and private exhaustion, Consuelo Vanderbilt at last stepped out of the marriage that had defined and nearly erased her. Freedom came to her late, but when it came, she recognized it immediately. She did not drift uncertainly into a new life. She chose one. That same year, with the wreckage of her divorce still fresh, she married Jacques Balsan, the elegant French aviator whose presence belonged to an entirely different moral universe from the one she had endured for so long. He was not a title to be acquired, not an estate to be rescued, not a dynastic solution disguised as a husband. He was a man who loved her. And that distinction, simple as it sounds, had been missing from the first half of her life. There is something deeply moving in the idea that he had loved her since youth, from before the machinery of ambition had fully closed around her. In another version of history, perhaps she would have met such love earlier, before rank, money, and maternal will had hardened into fate. But history rarely offers clean mercies. It offers, sometimes, a second life after the first one has been wasted. For Consuelo, that second life seems to have brought what the first never did: emotional safety. The great irony of her story is that she had already known the highest forms of public splendor. Palaces, jewels, titles, enormous rooms, full of important people, and yet none of those things amounted to happiness. Later, when she wrote about her life, she found the contrast with almost painful clarity. The first marriage was glitter, brilliant, expensive, admired, and fundamentally empty. The second was gold, warmer, quieter, and real. In Jacques Balsan, she appears to have discovered not spectacle, but tenderness, not prestige, but peace. That peace endured long enough to redeem something. And then, as it so often does in lives marked by early suffering, grief returned in old age with merciless efficiency. In 1956, her younger son, Ivor, fell gravely ill and died. Only weeks later, Jacques, aged, fragile, and himself nearing the end, followed him. To lose both a child and the man who had made her later life worth inhabiting within the span of 2 months is the kind of blow that does not simply wound. It hollows. After that, Consuelo seems to recede into the shadows of her own era. She remained alive, but with the air of someone who had outlived not only the people she loved most, but the world that had formed her. By the time she died in 1964, she had become something rarer than an heiress, rarer even than a duchess, a surviving witness to the emotional cost of the Gilded Age. She carried in her life the full arc of that world, its polish, its cruelty, its bargains, its vanities, and its hidden casualties. What endured after her was not the title, nor even the scandal, but the shape of the story itself. A girl offered up to ambition, a woman reclaimed by love, and an old age haunted by absence. In the end, Consuelo Vanderbilt outlasted the glitter. What remained was the gold, and the grief that proved it had been real.